Welcome to Antitrust Code by Concurrences. Concurrences is the leading antitrust database, with over 30,000 articles on competition law. Concurrences is also the largest network of antitrust experts, with lawyers, economists, enforcers, and academics in 85 countries. By listening to this podcast, you will learn the fundamentals of competition law and hear about the latest antitrust news, thanks to our guests, the best experts in the antitrust world.
So we're meeting today as part of the Concurrence Antitrust Horizon Meet the Enforcers event in Brussels, an event that is supported by Clifford Chance and Compass Lexecon. I'm Neil Dryden, an economist at Compass Lexecon, and I'm delighted that we have Martijn Snoep from the Dutch Competition Authority joining us for this podcast. And later for the panel that we'll be having in the evening. The theme, as I've said, is Antitrust Horizons, Meet the Enforcers. And it seems to me that there has perhaps rarely been a better time to discuss what is on the antitrust horizon, because we are living in a period of considerable uncertainty and flux in competition policy, exemplified including in the recent Draghi report, which it seems to me has raised a lot of ideas, but also questions about the future direction of competition policy. And I think we are particularly lucky, if I may say so, to have Martijn joining us for the podcast, because you are a proponent of changes in competition policy and a thinker about the competition policy regime and how it should evolve as we move forward. So you are, if I can say so, the ideal guest for this podcast.
I hope I can live up to the expectation, though.
I'm sure. So if we can just begin, before we get into some of the specific areas of the application of competition policy, if we can just sort of begin very big picture. I've already referred to the Draghi report that was obviously motivated by various things, including poor productivity performance in Europe and a lack of European participation, if I can put it that way, in the first wave of the digital age. And it's a report that says many things, but clearly among those is the central idea that competition policy can't stand still and has to evolve. And then we see that being carried through into the mission letter to the Commissioner designate to take over with, again, the idea that competition policy has to adapt considerably. So I would like to start with your big picture view on Draghi, the mission letter to the Commissioner, and just what is your interpretation of the broad picture in terms of where competition policy is and may well be heading.
Now, I think the first thing I have to explain about myself, I like change and development. So I think that is good, and I find from that perspective the Draghi report exciting, because it gives new perspectives. Second thing is, if you look at the competition policy and the competition enforcement tools, we have two tools that were developed in the late 50s and early 60s. And then the last major, I would say, substantive reform of European competition policy was the introduction of the merger control regime in 1990. So it's not change. It's strange that we are now looking, at the toolbox. Is it still fit for the problems that we are facing today? So this is what I really like about the Draghi report, what I like about the mission letter. And the good thing in both the report and the mission statement is that it puts competition central, and that is not a given. We see in many markets, particularly consumers, have doubts whether competition is actually bringing benefits to them. And we as competition enforcers have to explain our position and why competition is good for people, is good for businesses, and in the end will bring better value than a completely regulated market. And that tension, I think, is now is visible in the mission statement, and it is something that we as competition enforcers, but also as drivers of competition policy have to take into account.
So can I, before we get into the specific areas, can I just probe that a little bit more, because I think it's obviously fundamental. You said that the mission letter is and Draghi perhaps are making competition a central concept, but there might be an alternative view that competition was kind of central and didn't have any kind of rivals as the ultimate objective, but now other ideas are encroaching that might be potentially in some circumstances in tension with competition. The idea of resilience, if resilience means scale, even explicit references to scale, and then references to other things that may in some circumstances be in tension with competition, like environmental objectives and transition, and etc. So can you just elaborate a little bit on the notion of your confidence, if you like, that competition is central, or maybe you were saying that we have to advocate for competition remaining, as a central objective?
No, I've always seen competition not as a goal in itself, but as an instrument to reach certain goals. And if you look at the position of European competition enforcement, the European competition rules in the treaty, that's also what it is. It is an instrument to achieve the objectives of the European Union. One of the instruments, not the only instrument. And of course, what I like is that the Draghi report and the mission statement still see the value of this instrument to reach these goals. But it doesn't mean that we have all the necessary instruments, and that the instruments, the way we deploy them, if we have deployed them over the past whatever many decades, is the right way to deploy them given the current challenges. But what you see is that it's not that let's throw competition overboard. No, it's we need competition regulation. We need regulation that increases competition, because when competition leads to the results that we ultimately want as a society.
Okay, that's very clear. And if I can now get into a little bit more detail on one of the tools. It's actually mentioned in Draghi, but I think you're a forerunner of this because it's, I know, an issue that's quite close to your heart. Sometimes referred to as new competition tools. And coming from a UK perspective, I think it is close to what we think of as a market investigation reference. So could you just tell us a little bit more about, and if we start at the national level, then we can maybe move to the European position. From a Netherlands perspective, can you just describe a bit more why you have been such a strong advocate as this for this as an extra tool in your toolkit?
I think there are two developments that we see. First is an increasing level of concentrations in many markets. Not only the digital markets, but also more traditional markets, banking, insurance. There are many markets where markets have become more concentrated, and where there is less entry, and maybe less entry than we'd expected due to high barriers to entry. Can be because of regulatory entry to barriers, can also because of scale, can also because deliberately the existing companies keep their know ways to keep their competitors out. Second, what we see, a worrying level of innovation. That's also what Draghi, of course, focuses on in its report. And an important driver to innovation is obviously competition and openness of competitive markets for new entry. And we see at the same time that the current instruments that we have are insufficient to make these markets more contestable and contestable for entry. We have our 101 instrument, and of course, that works to a certain extent, but only in case of strict violations of actual contractual restrictions of competition. We have our abuse of dominance rules, which also, allow enforcement actions to create more entry, but tacit collusion, for example, tacit collusion to keep competitors out. by refusing access to infrastructure, by refusing data portability or interoperability, is very hard to tackle with the current instruments. Another issue is that, for example, things like vendor lock-in, what we see in many markets where customers are tied to their suppliers, it makes it incredibly difficult for new suppliers to enter the market because they cannot get new customers. Yep. And these phenomena are very difficult to tackle with the current instrument. And it is especially for these types of competition issues that we see the market investigation tool or the new competition tool, whatever you want to call it, is a good instrument. It is I would say a competition regulation instrument where competition authorities are very well positioned to apply them in a proportionate, non-political way in order to increase competition in the market.
And can I ask, in terms of thinking about case selection and still on what would be the Dutch cases, is this more suitable for national markets? Because if the market is a European market or a global market, it's arguably a bit less obvious, certainly on the structural side, what you can do.
No, absolutely. So this is, I think, at the national level, a typical instrument that you would use in national markets with predominantly national companies active in that particular market. Could even be in local market, regional markets. But in order to, and this is kind of a bridge to a logical follow-up question, in order to avoid a fragmentation of the internal market, we think it's also important to address these issues at the European level, so that we have a new competition tool also at the European level where the market is more typical European-wide or encompasses more countries.
Yes, and indeed, as I mentioned already, the Draghi report is advocating that.
Yeah.
Given that a similar tool has been in the part of the UK regime for some time, I just wondered if you had any observations on how you think it has worked.
No, I think what is fantastic is that we have, we can build on the UK experience of the past decades. And you see, I've looked at it. I'm not a study of the UK, researcher of the UK market investigation tool, but I've looked, how this developed over the years, and it's interesting to see. And that's also at the same time that the danger, it has become more and more sophisticated over time.
Yes.
And it could be, and it's also what I hear from true scholars of the market investigation regime, is that maybe it has become too sophisticated, and that it takes a very long time before there is a decision, and maybe we can learn from that. The UK is absolutely a forerunner in this area, and we should learn from its experience, but also try to scale it to kind of the appropriate level for the issues that are arising nowadays.
Yes. Okay. And just before we leave this topic, could you just give us a quick update on when should we expect to see, when might we see the first Dutch application of the new competition?
Yeah, well, first we have to change the law, of course. So what we can do now, and that's also what we're doing at the moment, we have the authority to conduct market investigations, and we now are conducting market investigation as if we have a new competition tool, but instead of imposing remedies, we now give very specific recommendations to the government to change the law in a way we would do somehow under a new competition tool.
Okay.
And that's interesting. We recently finished a market study into interest rates for consumer savings, where we found that it was very likely that tacit collusion was occurring between the three major banks in the Netherlands, and we gave recommendations to the government to make the market, work better, more contestable, and stimulate consumers to shop and to increase competition in the market.
Okay. Merger control. This is another area where I know you have been advocating for changes at the national level.
Yep.
And I think your concern there has been an enforcement gap around small mergers. So are you able just to give us a sort of your view on that and an update on where you think you are with respect to that gap?
Yeah. So again, we have I would say an EU-style merger control regime, obviously with much lower thresholds. But there is a minimum threshold, and the minimum threshold is 30 million euros in the Netherlands by the target. And what we see is that there are a number of transactions that escape our review. The well-known killer acquisitions that mostly take place at the European or global scale. So if you look, for example, at Illumina Grail, we were one of the initiating countries to refer that case up to the European Commission so that it could review that merger under the infamous Dutch clause. Well, we all know how that ended. So that gap is no longer plugged with the Dutch clause. So we need to come up with a solution of our own. I think something that you see more at the national level, at least in the Netherlands, is what we call buy and build strategies, or beat stringing, or companies that make many different smaller mergers to create a new champion in the market. Mostly driven by private equity, but not exclusively. And as such, that is fine. It's not something that we are against. But what we also see is that in some markets, these players, rake in smaller companies that have a turnover below the threshold and remain unnoticed, even up to the point that they are able to create a dominant position. And I think that worries us. And so for the two reasons, killer acquisitions and buy and build strategies, we want a tool where we can call in mergers and within a certain time frame, and then be able to review them to see whether they have any anti-competitive effects. Of course, we looked at different instruments, what would work best, maybe lowering the thresholds, like they do in some other countries, introducing a transaction value threshold. But we believe that will only increase the administrative burden. So what we propose to the government is to, on the one hand, increase the lower threshold from 30 million to 50 million euros, and at the same time give us call-in power so that we can call in the mergers that are of particular interest to us. And ultimately that will lead to a decrease of the administrative burden for companies and for us as well, so we can focus our resources on the things that really matter.
And would you envisage any limitations on the call-in powers, or that can be irrespective of?
Yeah, so what I do understand, I was a private practitioner myself, so I understand deal dynamics. So there should be kind of a window during which you can call in a transaction, and whether that is 2 or 3 months or 6 months. I mean, I'm more than happy to think about that and be open to any solution, but it should be a finite period, that once that period is over, it's over and done with.
Very clear. Okay, another area of change, we're not short of areas of change, the Article 102 draft guidelines obviously on the exclusion side. Wasn't planning to spend too long on this, but I think it's maybe fair to say the draft guidelines have not met with a super enthusiastic response from some quarters. They're an attempt to consolidate the case law, but perhaps in the attempt to do so, in the eyes of some, lack coherence and lack limiting principles. I just wondered, what is your perspective on this area of enforcement?
Yeah, so what I see is that there is clearly no consensus among practitioners and academics on the interpretation of the case law. I think more so in 102 than in any other area. I don't know what the reason for that is. I'm not sure whether it has to do with the lack of clarity of the case law of the court, because that is pretty clear. But I think there are a number of very well-known, opinionated private practitioners, academics that have their own strong views on 102, how 102 should be interpreted. So I hope and I trust that the Commission is not too much put off by this lack of consensus and follows its own course. And therefore I reckon, I think it's the guidelines serve a good purpose. It's a great start for a very good discussion. I think the draft as it is now is very good. Maybe can be improved and tweaked here and there on the basis of the latest case law, but ultimately I think that's it. This is the direction it should be, and it will help enforcement. It will help national courts, and ultimately I think that's also with guidelines. If we as a competition enforcement community get it wrong, we'll be corrected by the courts. But it's good to have a line of reasoning, a line of how we interpret the case law, a policy for the enforcement that creates a legal certainty that companies always complain about, that there isn't enough of it.
Yes. I guess the amount of legal certainty delivered by the guidelines will perhaps be hotly debated, but
yeah, it's not the legal certainty that maybe some companies wanted to have, but it's legal certainty undeniably.
Okay. Perhaps abusing Donald Rumsfeld, it's a kind of certain uncertainty.
Well, yeah, it's a certain certainty. You know how the competition enforcement community is going to interpret the laws, and whether you can disagree, but that's the legal certainty does not necessarily mean that you agree with that legal certainty that was achieved.
Okay. Final area, and obviously we're not covering everything, but is the which is the DMA, which we'll be discussing quite a lot this evening. Obviously, that's operating at the European level. I'd like to come in a second to the degree of sort of national versus cooperation around things like the DMA. But just before we get there, I would just be interested in your perspective, to some extent as an observer, on how the DMA is going so far, and your take about what you think is kind of on the horizon for the DMA.
Well, I'm impressed with the speed and the kind of the depth of the competition of the Commission's enforcement efforts under the DMA so far. I think this is unprecedented. How quickly the Commission adopted a completely new law in such a difficult field in such a short time. Second, I think and that's also felt by many national authorities, that this is a joint effort in the sense, yes, the Commission is by far the biggest player in this area, but we as national competition authorities also need to create the environment and the support for the Commission to make this a success. And we as ACM, now at this very moment, we have 3 ACM colleagues working with the Commission in joint investigation teams in DMA cases. And 2 of them have already returned, so we sent new ones. And what we see, I think that concept works very well. It's mutually beneficial. It helps the Commission, with more manpower, and at the same time, it helps us, national competition authorities, hopping on the bandwagon of the DMA enforcement, which we can also deploy in our own national practice. And that leads me to the final point is that, I hope that in the not too long away future, that the national authorities can also do kind of investigations, DMA type investigations, and then finish them up and deliver them as a package to the European Commission and the DMA team to finish them. And we are in a way, therefore, as is foreseen in the DMA, a sort of subcontractor for the Commission in running these types of investigations.
So just to explore that a little bit more, and then I think we'll move to sort of closing. So that kind of subcontract arrangement, is that, can you just elaborate on that a little bit? Is that purely investigating still at the national level? And if so, what does it entail? Is it surveying Dutch consumers to see how aspects of the DMA are affecting their welfare? Is it looking at Dutch small-scale entrants to see how their economics are being affected by the DMA or some other aspect? What's the kind of thing you would be doing?
The thing, what we don't do it yet. But I think this is kind of the part of the. If we are talking about horizons.
Indeed.
I think this is one of the things on the horizons, and what I foresee is that we do non-compliance investigations. Mm-hmm. Of course, there must be a specific Dutch angle, maybe a Dutch complainant, maybe an issue that is particular for the Netherlands, maybe a gatekeeper that is particularly strong in the Netherlands. So somehow, or could be also an area where we have previous experience. And then we can look for non-compliance, or we can investigate non-compliance in the Netherlands by that particular gatekeeper. And then refer the investigation once it's finished to the European Commission, so that they can use it in their entire enforcement mechanism.
Excellent. We've covered some specific areas. I want to just end with two closing questions, if I may. We've been focusing quite a lot on kind of gaps in areas where enforcement will be strengthened or added to. What do you think about the opposite problem to gaps, which is over-regulation or unnecessary regulation in some areas? Because there's obviously another strand of thought that says over-regulation is part of Europe's problem and a contributor to the productivity problem. So do you see any kind of scope for addressing, stripping away regulation in some areas?
Yes, we do. And we have, of course, there's been a change in the government in the Netherlands. We have now a Minister of Economic Affairs who, one of his, I don't know whether his first priority, but one of his first priorities is to deregulate. Mm-hmm. So what we do of course, we have a much wider mandate than only competition. We do consumer protection, sectoral regulation. So it's maybe in a way easier for us than for a traditional competition enforcement agency. But what we promise to do is every year we will issue a letter to the government with laws that, in our experience, can be striked out of the rule book. Laws that we enforce. So we go through our entire catalog of laws and particular regulations and see, what is basically no longer being enforced or what has lost its value in the public interest, and see what's happening. We don't know. It's new for us. It will be new for the government. It will be new for policymakers. But I think it's interesting, and it is good that we do this because we are very close to the functioning of markets in general. Our mission is to make markets work well. Well, okay, if regulations are in place that do not make markets work well, maybe have even a contrary effect, then it's also good for us to mention that.
Okay, and then one last question, which maybe takes us full circle. As we all know, underlying the Draghi report, the productivity problem in Europe, suggestion of increasing concentration, although that's open to debate. Potentially quite a low growth rate in Europe in the years ahead, and also competition agencies that are, in many cases rightly, pointing to problems in the conduct of firms. And a question I have is whether that is a recipe for Europeans losing faith in markets as a mechanism, and competition as a mechanism for delivering well-being. Yeah. And whether, as well as the role of agencies in enforcing, there's a parallel role for agencies in advocating that markets still are the best answer we have to making people well off. And I wonder that second element is one that you think is important and also forms part of the horizon.
Yeah, no, it does. I mean, this type of competition advocacy is extremely important for competition authorities to do. But it requires, I would say, some political skill and to communicate this. So one of the things that is important that we always say, whether goods and services are being distributed by the government or by the market is a political decision. We are not a union for competition. Yep. So there are pros and cons. There are not too many good examples of governments being able to distribute scarce goods and services, but there are also a few good examples. And if you think we live in a democratic society, if you think that the government can do a better job than the market, then be our guest. Second, and that helps. That makes us less.
It's a counterfactual, if I can say so. You need a counterfactual.
You need a counterfactual. So we ask,
government is the counterfactual.
Yeah, the government, and there is not that much trust in the government either.
Yes.
So I think consumers generally do not trust, or many consumers do not trust markets entirely.
Yeah.
But they do not trust the government either. So we do not say there is no ideal world. You have to look for the best possible solution. Second, there is no There is no contradiction between competition and regulation. There are no unregulated markets. If you have a minimum wage, you're already regulating a market. So the key issue is with how much regulation do you want in this market? So that's not, and therefore we do not want to be put in the camp of we are against all regulation, and if you regulate, that's per se bad. Yeah. So that's the third, and the second point, and then the third point is competition, and this is also culturally. In the Netherlands, competition also has a negative connotation because it is something, I take something and you can't get it. It's seen as a zero-sum game. Yeah. And it is to a certain aspect. And in countries with a more kind of consensual approach, that is, that doesn't always feel right. So we skip, this is good for competition or this is bad for competition. No, say this will lead to higher prices, lower quality, and less innovation. Yes. And that is something that people understand and can relate to. In the Netherlands, there are lots of people who cannot relate to competition, but they can relate to higher prices, lower quality, or less innovation.
Martijn, thank you. You certainly didn't disappoint. It was a fascinating insight into how you view the horizon, and I look forward to speaking to you further in the panel later.
Thank you very much.
You listened to an episode of Antitrust Code by Concurrences. If you want to read more about this topic, check the Concurrences website, where you can find all relevant articles. Follow us on Twitter @CompetitionLaws, and join the Concurrences group on LinkedIn to receive updates on our next podcast.